Hello audience, how are you? I hope you all are well. Welcome back to another video by Ghostly Gloom. Before we begin, I kindly request you to subscribe to Ghostly Gloom and hit the bell icon to receive more videos from us. After watching the video, please take a moment to like it and comment on how you felt while watching. Now, let's dive into the story. The year was 2019, and I had just moved into a quaint, old apartment building in a quiet neighborhood. Little did I know that my new neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, would soon become the source of my deepest fears. At first glance, Mrs. Thompson seemed like any other elderly lady. She lived alone in the apartment next to mine, and her wrinkled face held a permanent scowl. I often saw her peering out of her window, her eyes filled with an eerie intensity that sent chills down my spine. Despite her unsettling demeanor, I tried to be friendly, saying hello whenever we crossed paths in the hallway. One rainy evening, I returned home late from work, soaked to the bone. As I climbed the creaky stairs to my apartment, I heard a faint whisper coming from Mrs. Thompson's door. It was a low, haunting murmur that sent a shiver down my spine. I paused, straining to make out the words. "They are watching, always watching," she repeated over and over. My heart raced as I fumbled with my keys, desperate to get inside my apartment. That night, I couldn't sleep, haunted by Mrs. Thompson's eerie words. Who were they, and why was she so afraid? Over the next few weeks, I noticed strange occurrences around the building. I would hear footsteps outside my door in the dead of night, followed by soft knocking. When I peeked through the peephole, I never saw anyone. I began to suspect that someone was playing a cruel prank on me. One evening, I decided to confront Mrs. Thompson about the eerie occurrences. I knocked on her door, and after what felt like an eternity, she opened it slightly, just enough to peer out. Her eyes widened in fear as she saw me, and she quickly slammed the door shut. I could hear her frantic whispering on the other side, "They are here. They've come." I decided to call the police, convinced that Mrs. Thompson was in danger. When they arrived, they questioned her, but she refused to speak, only muttering about the watchers. The officers assured me that they would keep an eye on the situation. As days turned into weeks, the disturbances continued. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always lurking in the shadows. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a blood-curdling scream from Mrs. Thompson's apartment. I rushed to her door and banged on it, but there was no response. The door was unlocked, and I pushed it open to find the apartment in disarray. Furniture was overturned, and the walls were covered in cryptic symbols. Terrified, I called the police again. This time, they discovered Mrs. Thompson in the closet, curled up in a fetal position, muttering incoherently. They rushed her to the hospital, but she never recovered her sanity. The doctors diagnosed her with severe schizophrenia, attributing her bizarre behavior to her deteriorating mental state. With Mrs. Thompson gone, I hoped that the horrors plaguing my life would end, but they only intensified. The whispers in the night grew louder, and the footsteps outside my door became more menacing. I felt like a prisoner in my own home. One evening, as I returned from work, I found my apartment door ajar. Fear gripped me as I cautiously entered. The apartment had been ransacked, and a chilling message was scrawled on the wall in what looked like blood: "You next." I immediately called the police, and they launched an investigation into the series of disturbing events. They installed security cameras in the hallway and increased patrols around the building. But no matter what they did, the terror persisted. I couldn't take it any longer. I decided to break my lease and move away, hoping that a change of location would finally free me from the relentless horror. As I packed my belongings, I heard one final, bone-chilling whisper from the darkness, "They are everywhere." I never discovered the truth behind the horrors that plagued my life in that apartment building. To this day, I wonder if Mrs. Thompson's ramblings held some kernel of truth, or if it was all a product of her shattered mind. One thing is certain, though, the terror of those days will haunt me forever, chilling reminder that sometimes, the scariest horrors are the ones that happen right next door. In the quiet suburban neighborhood of Willowbrook, nestled under a canopy of ancient oaks, I moved into my dream home. The charming house had a white picket fence and a picturesque garden, but little did I know that my new neighbor, the enigmatic Mr. Blackwood, would soon turn my dream into a waking nightmare. Mr. Blackwood lived in the house next door, a dilapidated mansion that seemed to loom over my property like a sinister shadow. He was a recluse, rarely seen in the daylight, and the neighborhood buzzed with rumors about his mysterious past. His windows were always dark, and the overgrown shrubbery shielded his home from prying eyes. My curiosity got the better of me, and one sunny afternoon, I decided to introduce myself to Mr. Blackwood. I knocked on his door, and it swung open with a creak as if on its own. A cold breeze greeted me, carrying with it a faint scent of decay. I called out for Mr. Blackwood, but there was no response. The interior was dimly lit, and I could barely make out the shapes of dusty, old furniture. As I ventured deeper into the house, I felt a growing unease. The air grew colder, and I noticed peculiar paintings on the walls, portraits of people with hollow eyes and twisted smiles. My heart raced, and I knew I had overstayed my welcome. I hurried back to my own house, feeling as though I had narrowly escaped a trap. From that day on, strange things began to happen. In the dead of night, I would hear eerie music emanating from Mr. Blackwood's house, a haunting melody that sent shivers down my spine. Lights flickered, and the wind carried whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. My once thriving garden withered and died, as if some malevolent force was draining the life from it. I consulted with gardeners and even botanists, but no one could explain the inexplicable decay that had befallen my property. The nightmares began shortly after. I would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with vivid images of grotesque figures lurking in the shadows. Faces twisted in agony and contorted in unnatural ways haunted my dreams. Desperate for answers, I began to research the history of my neighborhood. It was then that I stumbled upon a chilling revelation. Mr. Blackwood's house had once belonged to a notorious serial killer who had terrorized the town decades ago. The victims' names matched those on the paintings I had seen in his home. Terrified, I contacted the police and shared my findings. They launched an investigation into Mr. Blackwood's past, but when they arrived at his house, they found it empty, devoid of any traces of his existence. It was as though he had never been there. The nightmares persisted, and I became a recluse in my own home, gripped by a paralyzing fear of the unseen horrors that lurked outside my window. I tried to sell my house, but potential buyers were spooked by the stories of Mr. Blackwood and the strange occurrences that plagued the neighborhood. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard footsteps in my hallway. My heart raced, and I clutched the covers tightly. The footsteps drew closer, and the door to my bedroom slowly creaked open. A figure stood in the doorway, cloaked in darkness, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly malevolence. I screamed and scrambled for the light switch, but when I flicked it on, the figure was gone. I was alone, but the feeling of dread lingered. That night marked the culmination of my terror, and I knew I had to leave Willowbrook behind. I sold my house at a loss and moved far away, leaving behind the nightmares and the haunted memories of Mr. Blackwood and his sinister home. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that he continues to haunt my dreams, a malevolent presence that refuses to be forgotten. The true horror of that neighborhood lay not in its picturesque facade, but in the darkness that dwelled behind closed doors, darkness that still haunts my every waking moment.